House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 1112, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to amend Chapter 44 of Title 18, United States Code, to strengthen the background check procedures to be followed before a federal firearms licensee may transfer a firearm to a person who is not such a licensee.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chair, I am pleased that today we are considering H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act. Yesterday, the House passed H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, an important bill to expand our national firearms background check system to include virtually all gun transfers. However, there are also steps we can take to make the current background check system more effective at blocking the sale of guns to individuals who are ineligible to purchase and possess them. That is why I support H.R. 1112, a bill that addresses a dangerous shortcoming in the current firearms background check law. In most cases, a licensed gun dealer receives notification within a few minutes, often 90 seconds, from the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, sometimes called the NICS, that a prospective buyer has passed or failed a background check. In a small percentage of cases, NICS examiners may require additional time to complete the background check if information is missing or unclear in a prospective buyer's record. For example, there may be on the record a notation that the prospective buyer was arrested, but no notation as to whether the buyer was acquitted or convicted. That would have to be looked into further. However, under current law, a licensed gun dealer conducting a background check on a prospective purchaser is permitted to sell the firearm to the purchaser if there has been no determination from NICS after 3 business days, even though NICS has not indicated that the person has actually passed the background check. Often we refer to this as a default proceed transaction. These are the very cases that ought to be investigated. In 2017 alone, the ATF determined that over 4,000 default proceed firearms transfers went to purchasers who should not lawfully have gotten them because they could not lawfully own a firearm. If NICS is unable to return an instant determination, and especially if there's no report after 3 days, there is real cause for concern. One notable example of the tragic consequences of this loophole is the hate crime murder of 9 people at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, in 2015. In that tragedy, the shooter was not legally allowed to possess a firearm as a result of drug charges, but he still was able to purchase his gun from a licensed dealer who made the decision to transfer after 3 business days had elapsed, despite not having received a definitive response from the background check system. The bill before us today, H.R. 1112, would strengthen the background check procedures federal firearms licensees or dealers must follow before selling or transferring a firearm. Under this bill, the initial period a gun dealer must wait for an answer from the NICS is extended from 3 days to 10 days. If after 10 days the NICS system has not returned an answer to the dealer, the prospective purchaser may file a petition with the Attorney General, which should help resolve most applications in short order. If an additional 10 days elapses without a response from NICS, the licensed firearms dealer then may sell or transfer the firearm to the prospective purchaser without the background check completion. If the dealer has no reason to believe that the purchaser is prohibited from obtaining a firearm under federal, state, or local law. The additional time for checks to be completed will help prevent the transfer of guns to individuals who are ineligible to possess them and will make us safer. I want to remind everyone that in 90% of the cases, the NICS system gives the answer within 90 seconds. So we're talking about a small number of cases, but a number of cases where we know there have been tragic results, and we want to stop that. I commend our colleague, Congressman Jim Clyburn, the distinguished Democratic whip, for introducing this bipartisan bill, which is a sensible and necessary approach to addressing this dangerous shortcoming in current law. Therefore, I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill today. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Here we go again. Just like yesterday, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle voted to criminalize the transfer of a firearm between 2 law-abiding citizens. Today, the further reveals the interest that they're bringing up a bill that would prohibit law-abiding citizens from ever being able to acquire firearms. And that's not hyperbole, Madam Chair. It's fact. In fact, let me just walk you through how that would happen. Allow me to explain that you would walk through the mechanics of this legislation. Let's start at the beginning of the month. Assume I went to a federally firearms license, an FFL, to purchase a firearm on Friday, February 1st of this month. Under H.R. 1112, the FBI's the NICS system has 10 business days to respond to the FFL. The 10th business day is a Friday, February the 15th. If after those 10 business days NICS does not okay the transfer, I must file a petition with the Department of Justice certifying that I have no reason to believe that I am prohibited by federal, state, or local law from purchasing or possessing a firearm. Once that petition is filed, the NICS system has an additional 10 days to make a determination. That would be Monday, March 5th in our example, because February 18th was a federal holiday and not a business day. If at the conclusion of the 20 business days waiting period, NICS does not deny the transfer, I could then acquire the firearm. But wait, Madam Chair. Under existing law, NICS background check is only valid for 30 calendar days. The date it is initiated under our example would be Saturday, March the 2nd, which is 2 days before my petition is required to be acted upon. At that point, I would be required to start the process over again entirely. There could be no end to this cycle. Now, I'm not sure if the H.R. 1112 was written this way out of just messed up writing or malice. I'm not sure, but it does do this, and there's no mistaking what is written. And as I have said many times, we do not vote on aspirational ideas in this chamber. They're great to debate, but we do not vote on aspirational ideas. We vote on words on paper, and words on paper are just as I have described. I'll let the American people determine what the intent was here. However, as I noted yesterday, in the rush to put this to the floor, they did not bother to fix several major issues. We also know, as we go forward in this, that this indefinite and perpetual delay of the transfer of firearms to law-abiding citizens is probably perhaps the intent of this bill. Keep in mind, under current law, an FFL has the option to transfer the firearm after 3 business days, unless the transfer has been denied by NICS. I would contend 3 business days is not instant, and a month is anything but instant, particularly as technologies continue to advance. These laws have real-world consequences, and consequences can be deadly. Carol Brown, of New Jersey resident, with a restraining order against her ex-boyfriend. Her application for a firearm took longer than 40 days to process, and he stabbed her to death while she was waiting to legally protect herself. Let that sink in. This bill would empower abusers and violent predators by making their victims more vulnerable. Madam Chair, we oppose this legislation. It doesn't make sense in its current form. It will do nothing to make our community safer, but it will make it harder for law-abiding citizens to exercise their Second Amendment rights and to defend themselves and their families. And Madam Chair, I'm not often going to be able to say this, but I am joined today by the ACLU, who is opposing this bill and scoring against this bill. It's not ready for prime time. It's ready to go back to actually have hearings and actually do markups and actually work with this bill. I appreciate the gentleman, especially from South Carolina's intent. No one fights stronger for his constituency than the gentleman from South Carolina. This is just not the right piece of legislation at the right time for the reasons that I have spoke of that have nothing to do with the intent. It has everything to do with words on paper. And remember, Madam Chair, that's what we vote on, not aspirational ideas. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 7 minutes to the distinguished Democratic whip, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my friend for yielding me the time. And I request permission to revise and extend.
Without objection.
I have a prepared text here that I would like to enter into the record. But let me begin my remarks, first of all, by welcoming to our Capitol today Ms. Jennifer Pinckney and her two daughters. There are the wife and children of Reverend Clemente Pinckney, who, along with 8 of his Bible study parishioners, lost his life to a demented white supremacist who said that he was interested in starting a race war. He entered their church, participated in the Bible study, which they welcomed him into. And as they closed their study that evening and prayed for what they had experienced and for their next meeting, this gentleman, while their eyes were closed, opened his and slaughtered them. I find it interesting that my colleague has talked about the inconvenience of waiting longer than 3 days to purchase a weapon, without mentioning those poor souls of Emmanuel AME Church. He's talked about people who might be inconvenienced. He's talked about something he read in the newspapers, but he has not mentioned them. Well, I'm here today to say that the members of this august body need to think a little bit about the value of those lives. Are they more valuable than the inconvenience a gun purchaser may have by having to wait 10 rather than 3 days to make a purchase? What would make one so anxious to purchase a gun in the first place? If you've got to have a gun right now, chances are you have no useful purpose, no redeeming value in the purchase of that gun. And maybe we ought to participate here as members of this body in helping this purchaser with a cooling off period, which is all we are asking to do here. Charleston, South Carolina is nicknamed the Holy City. Churches, steeples dominate the skyscape line of this historic city, which until recently had an ordinance that no building could be constructed higher than 55 feet, wanting nothing to obstruct its steeples. Faith is fundamental to the Charleston community. However, that faith was rocked in June 2015 when this lone gunman rushed into this Bible study after studying the most historic African-American churches in the state of South Carolina. Develop a list of 5 churches, one of which was Emmanuel AME. He, by his own admission, selected this church because of its importance to the African-American community, being the first organized place of worship in the South for African-Americans. He selected this. This was a hate crime of the first order. And we are saying we should not inconvenience him. And we did not inconvenience him. We allowed him to get that gun after 3 days, when it was around the 5th day that they found the glitch in the system and found him to be ineligible to own a gun. We just had a gunman go into his workplace in Aurora, Illinois. He was ineligible to have a gun, but he was allowed to purchase the gun, and when they found out that he was ineligible to have a gun, they then sent him a letter and said, please bring us the gun back. You are not eligible to have a gun. Give me a break. No, he didn't return the gun because he had no redeeming value in having the gun. And he murdered his co-workers. And you're telling me we should not inconvenience him. Well, my colleague, the chair of the committee, has laid out for you the procedure in this bill, a procedure that makes it a maximum, irrespective of what my colleague may say, it is a maximum of 20 working days, business days, that one would have in order to purchase a gun. I would hope as we move forward here today, we would think about those post souls of Emmanuel AME Church. We'll think about those 4,000 people, 4,200 people who purchased guns in 2016 using this loophole. The 4,800 people who purchased guns in 2017 using this loophole. Think about their families. Think about their children.
Gentleman's time has expired.
And think about what we're about to do here today.
Madam Speaker, I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you for yielding me an additional minute. Let me just take this minute to go back to what I had prepared to say here today. In troubling times, many of us find solace in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. The Charleston loophole is something all members of Congress should have the courage to change, and by doing so, grant the American people the serenity they deserve in their schools, in their entertainment venues, in their neighborhood streets, and God forbid, in their places of worship. Are you back?
The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from New York reserves, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, I have great sympathy for what the gentleman from South Carolina just spoke of. But also I have even greater sympathy for the fact that it could have been avoided and had nothing, frankly, to do at the end when the FBI under Mr. Comey actually admitted that there was mistakes made. The FBI could have stopped that instead of letting it happen. They saw problems, they let it go. It could have stopped. This was already in law, Madam Chair. It could have stopped. And yes, what I laid out for you is not just simply 20 business days. When you look at the fact that coupled with other restrictions, it can do what we said. I have great sympathy and grief for every loss of life, no matter where it comes from. But to simply say that this would have fixed it when the FBI and others knew they could have fixed it at that moment and could have went later and got the guns because there was a delay even in the horrific act that happened, again, we're simply talking about what's on the paper. And with that, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Chairman, we all deplore and mourn the monstrous, despicable, and evil massacre in Charleston. But that terrible crime was committed 67 days after the perpetrator applied to purchase the firearm. As Mr. Collins said, this was preventable if, under current law, it was a failure of the FBI and not of the law. This bill is not about public safety, Most gun predators already get their firearms illegally, and a recent Johns Hopkins study found that California's universal background check had no effect on gun violence. Their true objective is to make gun ownership by law-abiding people so legally hazardous and so bureaucratically time-consuming that people simply give up. This bill cleverly, and I believe insidiously, sets up a potentially never-ending bureaucratic review process. As Mr. Collins said, a background check is only good for 30 calendar days from the day you apply, but this bill sets up a 20 business day delay process. Now, what that means is, if a single holiday falls within that window, or the store is closed on weekends, or you slip a single day on that timetable, your background check's no longer valid, and you have to start all over again in a perpetual cycle of Kafkaesque proportions. Now, would a bureaucracy be so abusive as to play this game? Well, of course it would. Just ask Lois Lerner. I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves, and the gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, the chair of the Crime Subcommittee, Ms. Bass.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Madam Chair, I support H.R. 112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019, as a common-sense measure to improve the current firearms background check system and to save lives. 25 years ago today, we began implementation of the Brady Background Checks Act, the system it employs to run background checks on those seeking to purchase firearms from licensed gun dealers has made us safer. Now it is time to address the circumstances in which the FBI needs additional time to investigate information relating to a prospective purchaser when the records may not be immediately clear as to whether someone is legally allowed to purchase a firearm. Under current law, after 3 days, a gun dealer has the discretion to sell a gun to a purchaser if the system has not given a green light to the sale when after 3 business days have passed without a denial being issued by the system. In these circumstances, it is the choice of the dealer as to whether to proceed with the sale, which we call a default proceed, or whether to wait for the check to be implemented. The results of such a choice were tragic in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015 when a young man filled with hate shot and killed 9 worshipers at the Emmanuel AME Church. The gun used in this murder had been transferred by a gun dealer to the shooter, even though the check had not been completed by the FBI, but which would have resulted in a denial had the check been finished. This is not an isolated incident. Since 1994, gun sellers proceeded with between 3,000 and 4,000 default proceeds sales per year. Analyzing data provided by the Department of Justice, one study found that such sales are 8 times more likely to involve a prohibited purchaser than other background checks. In 2017 alone, default proceeds sales accounted for more than 4,800 transfers to purchasers who were prohibited from owning firearms. The FBI reported that in 07 and 08, in cases a licensed seller sold a firearm through a default proceed transfers.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
The gentlelady is recognized.
The FBI reported that in 07 and 08, in cases where a licensed seller sold a firearm through default proceed transfers, approximately 22% of the individuals investigated were legally prohibited from purchasing or possessing a firearm. The additional time provided by H.R. 1112 is not too much to ask so that we may help prevent tragedies such as the Charleston shooting from happening. This is why I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill today. I yield back balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman from Georgia for the time. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 1112. This legislation is an attack on the constitutional rights of Americans. This bill puts incredible roadblocks in the way of law-abiding citizens seeking to exercise their Second Amendment rights that are guaranteed to them in the Constitution. We should be focused on enforcing the current laws that we have on the books instead of passing federal mandates that stifle freedom. This bill creates a bureaucratic maze that will allow the federal government to sit on its hands and force citizens to submit formal petitions to the Attorney General when they are trying to legally purchase a firearm, to ask permission to exercise a constitutional right. What other constitutional right would you suggest we put this level of restriction on? The freedom of press? The freedom of religion? Should we start having the federal government review every media outlet's story for 10 days before they can be published? Before a church can meet for worship? I don't think so. It's my hope that we'll soon move forward with solutions that will actually make a difference for hardworking Americans across this great country. When I was sworn in as a member of the House earlier this year, I saw great potential for Congress to come together and advance solutions to our nation's greatest problems. Instead, I find myself standing here on the floor of this chamber fighting for the basic liberties that our founding fathers sought to guarantee for every American. Well, I will continue to stand and continue to fight each and every day, and I urge the House to reject this misguided legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves, and the gentleman from New York
Now
is
yield
recognized.
1 minute to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their community, whether they're at work, at home, at school, or at church. Less than 2 weeks ago, 5 people, 4 of whom were my constituents, left their homes for work at the Henry Pratt Company in Aurora, Illinois, and never returned. Their lives were taken by a horrific act of gun violence. I am committed to honoring the lives of the victims of gun violence through action. H.R. 1112 is an important bill that will help address a deficiency in background check laws by allowing law enforcement to conduct a thorough background check. I am proud to co-sponsor an amendment that will help ensure this legislation improves the safety of victims of domestic violence, domestic abuse, dating partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Yesterday was the first time in more than 2 decades that this U.S. House of Representatives passed a major gun safety bill, and today we have an opportunity to take a further step. H.R. 1112 will help save innocent lives, and I look forward to working on common sense legislation that balances protecting our gun rights and ensuring the safety of our communities. Madam Speaker, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York reserves, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this time, I yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rowe.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for yielding. I rise today to fight for the rights of the brave men and women who have risked their lives fighting for our rights. The bill we're debating, H.R. 1112, would have a significant impact on veterans' Second Amendment rights. A little-known and poorly understood provision of H.R. 1112 would amend the law to make it unlawful for an individual who has been, quotes, adjudicated with mental illness, severe developmental disability, or severe emotional instability, end quotes, to possess a firearm. It would make it illegal to sell a firearm to such an individual. Let's put this in perspective. There are over 1.6 million disabled veterans with service-connected adjudication by VA of mental illness, including 1 million veterans with PTSD. H.R. 1112 has the potential to add all those names of veterans to the FBI Nixus list and prevent those veterans from being able to purchase or possess a firearm. Now, I know that may not have been the intent of the author of this bill, but that's a lot of veterans who will be impacted if this becomes law. I offered an amendment to the Rules Committee to clarify that veterans with VA, PTSD, diagnosed mental illness, and other affected adjudications would be exempt from the bill's standards, but it was ruled out of order. VA already sends the names of veterans who have a VA fiduciary for inclusion to the Nixus list, not because there's a concern that the veteran might be a harm to themselves or others, but because the VA has determined that the veteran needs assistance handling his or her financial benefits. I'm concerned that the expanded definition proposed in H.R. 1112 would infringe on the Second Amendment rights of over 1 million veterans solely because they receive benefits from VA that they have rightly earned through their service to our great country. The last thing any of us in this room want to do is to discourage veterans from seeking VA benefits and treatment because they're afraid it might cost them a constitutional right. Think about that. Although there may not have been a finding by judicial authority that a veteran possesses a danger to themselves or society, these veterans would be told that they were good enough to use a firearm to fight for our freedoms, but they're not good enough to have the freedom to bear arms as a civilian. That's wrong, Madam Chair. Even criminals must be convicted in a court of law before their names are added to the nixus list. Of all Americans who deserve their constitutional rights, the most deserving are those who fought for our country. That's why I strongly oppose H.R. 1112, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill. I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Georgia, member of the committee, Ms. McBath.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. I rise in support of H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019. After losing my son, Jordan, to gun violence in 2012, I began reaching out to other families who recently lost a loved one to gun violence. I would send them letters, and that's how I came to know Reverend Sharon Risher of Charlotte, North Carolina. On June 17, 2015, Reverend Risher lost her mother, 2 cousins, and a childhood friend when a young man shot and killed 9 people during a prayer service at the Emmanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Today, with H.R. 1112, we can close the loophole in background checks for the gun purchase that led to their terrible loss. I support this legislation for Reverend Sharon Risher and the memory of her family and her loved ones. Tragically, this was not the last time our country witnessed horrific violence in a place of worship. A few months ago, the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, took the lives of 11 human beings. Our places of worship, whether they are churches, synagogues, mosques, or something else, should be safe places of love, support, and community. H.R. 1112 would allow law enforcement the time that they need to make sure all these community centers are places of peace and safety. Yesterday, we voted to expand background checks. Today, we vote to make sure those background checks are thorough, even if a few of them take a few more days to process. Those few extra days will save lives. In the days after the Emmanuel shooting, I was there in the community, praying with the community and dealing with their pain and loss. And America deserves better than this. Why not make sure that we're doing everything that we can to protect them? A few more days and making sure that the FBI has the ability to really soundly make a conscious and critical decision. America deserves that. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
At this time, Madam Chair, I'm going to reserve.
The gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I heard the argument from the other side a moment ago that people judged ineligible for the system by the VA that their name should not be given into the system so that they may purchase firearms. I would point out that one of the largest sources of mortality among veterans is suicide. Veterans are, I think, the highest group in our society in terms of suicide rate. So it really makes sense to make it easier for people adjudged not to be proper to have a gun if you're worried about suicides. That argument is frankly nonsensical, and I'm very glad the VA helps protect our veterans by participating in the system. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, member of the committee and the chairman of one of our subcommittees, Mr. Cicilline.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman for yielding, and I would just point out in further support of Mr. Nadler's remarks, on average, 20 veterans commit suicide every single day in this country, and 2/3 of those suicides are caused by use of a gun. So Mr. Nadler is quite right. I rise in strong support of H.R. 112 to close the Charleston loophole. We've heard a lot about what's at stake in terms of constitutional rights as it relates to possession of a firearm. There are other constitutional rights that are at issue here, and that is the right to life, liberty, the right to live free of gun violence and death, the right of a grandmother to sit on her porch and enjoy a summer evening free from the dangers of gun violence, the right of young children to play in a playground and play safely. So this legislation is very important because it closes a very significant loophole in our law. Over the last 2 decades, the Charleston loophole has allowed more than 60,000 purchases of guns by prohibited individuals. Let that sink in. 60,000 people who were prohibited from having a gun by law were allowed to get those guns because of this loophole. One of those purchasers was a white supremacist who used the gun that he purchased to kill 9 worshipers at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Even though he had a felony drug charge on his record, this killer was able to buy a gun because his background check wasn't completed in 3 days. And he isn't the only one, of course. A 2016 GAO report found that between 2006 and 2015, guns were transferred to about 6,700 people with domestic violence convictions and more than 500 individuals with prohibiting protective orders. So there are many, many examples where the American people are less safe because criminals and disqualified people can access a firearm because the background check wasn't completed in 3 days. This is a very simple, common sense solution to that problem. Our laws will not work if we don't keep guns out of the hands of criminals, dangerous people, other disqualified purchasers. And this bill does that. This is a common sense proposal. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I thank Mr. Clyburn for his leadership and thank Mr. Nadler for bringing these bills before the Judiciary Committee so we can finally take some responsible action to reduce gun violence in this country. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from New York is recognized, and the reserves, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I am actually glad, and one thing I will agree on with my friend just now is I do agree that there is a right to life, and that's why I would love to see this House bring forth the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, which also protects life as well. And with that, I'll reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves, and the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chair, at this time I would like to address a concern that has been raised about one section of the bill that is unrelated to the changes to current law to address the Charleston loophole. Section 3 of the bill replaces outdated and offensive terminology in the categories of individuals who are ineligible to purchase or possess firearms under current law. Among those included, there are individuals subject to such prohibitions because, as stated by the current law, they are, quote, adjudicated as a mental defective, unquote. In the Judiciary Committee's markup of the bill, we agreed with our ranking member, Representative Collins, to replace this offensive language and to insert different terminology in the bill as a placeholder as we work to develop alternative language that does not alter the scope of who is included in these prohibitions and work with stakeholders who have interest in how this would be accomplished. We have heard from various advocates in the mental health, disability rights, and veterans communities who have expressed their desire to develop an acceptable alternative. We agree. Yesterday, the Veterans of Foreign Wars brought their concerns related to this issue to our attention. VFW agrees that the current terminology is archaic, but is concerned about a potential unintended consequence of replacing it. Their concern is that replacing these terms with, quote, mental illness, severe developmental disability, or severe emotional instability, unquote, could result in some veterans who are not now included being added to the NICS index due to their receipt of VA care or benefits for mental illnesses such as PTSD or a traumatic brain injury. It is not the intent of the changes in this terminology made by Section 3 to alter the scope of those currently considered to be, quote, adjudicated as a mental defective. It is the intent simply to replace that offensive language, but not to change the underlying law. We will work with stakeholders, including the VFW, the mental health community, and the disability rights community, to address the concerns related to this outdated terminology in a manner that does not change the scope of present law as this bill proceeds. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do appreciate the gentleman from New York clarifying that. But he just clarified it in the very way, because we had brought this up. It was late in the day, and we brought this up, and this language was offensive. And frankly, Ms. Lofgren, who was in the chair at the time, presented this language as an alternative to get us to a place where, as we talked about, to get to rules to actually fix this. This is why I have said so many times that I understand the majority's willingness to bring a bill forward. What I didn't understand here is the willingness of this majority to put themselves on a timetable to bring bills that were not ready. The reason we did it that night was so that we could get to rules. I served on Rules Committee for 4 years. We could have fixed it at Rules. And Dr. Rowe actually just brought an amendment at Rules, but was rejected. I understand that now we're going to continue forward. I have a daughter who has spina bifida, and many would say mental defective, and then for anyone in that community who believes that these who are born that way would be mental defective is a problem. It needs to be fixed. But the problem that we have here was a committee process that broke and a rules process that broke. There were plenty of opportunities to address this, plenty of opportunities to discuss this. And now, in the rush to do, again, what I said yesterday many times, what makes you feel good does not always heal you. And now you have a problem, a valid problem. But it was not a problem from the perspective of not trying to fix it. It came from a heart on both sides of the aisle to say this language is archaic. This language should not be there. There were plenty of times to fix it. I appreciate the chairman, and I'm glad to hear his willingness to continue to work on this. What would another day have taken? What would an amendment voted up or down by Dr. Rowe could have had on the floor? I guess when the ACLU and others started scoring against it, we decided we might need to fix it. Again, this is a process problem, and I know nobody likes to talk about process problems. Because at the end of the day, I believe the authors' intents behind these bills, I believe their intents are good. I believe their process may be wrong, and I'll speak to that. But this is a problem that we have. I'm glad the chairman is moving forward. I'm glad the chairman is looking at this, and I'm glad the chairman is willing to address this going forward. But it's just sad that we had to get here today, because this could have been fixed, except for an arbitrary timeline put onto my chairman that he really had no control over, I believe, to bring something forward that's not ready for prime time. I respect my chairman. I'm glad that he has addressed this. I hope that they will give him plenty of time in the future to continue to work these problems out. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, our mistake was in accepting the amendment from the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins. The amendment dealt with the underlying language of the underlying law, not with the bill. We should have insisted that an attempt to correct that language be in a separate bill. The gentleman from Georgia is now telling us that we should kill this bill that will save so many lives because we have not figured out acceptable language to replace existing bad language in the existing law that had nothing to do with this bill. We should pass this bill. We will work as we go forward to see if we can come up with acceptable language. But in any event, we should pass this bill and deal with the separate problem of bad language in the underlying law separately. How much time do I have, Madam Chair?
The gentleman from New York has 6 minutes remaining.
I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. Madam Speaker, I rise today for Myra Thompson and Susie Jackson, people who were murdered in their church during a Bible study. And I rise for the tens of thousands of Americans who will die if Congress does not close the Charleston loophole. In 2015, the FBI reported that more than 270,000 guns were sold because the NICS system failed to issue a do not sell order within 3 days. One was sold to a man with a hate-filled heart, as we have heard. He walked into Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, a historically black church, and murdered 9 people who were simply seeking to get closer to their God. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we have seen this time and time again. Our houses of worship are not safe from gun violence. Mother Emanuel, First Baptist, Sutherland Springs, Tree of Life, Oak Creek's House of Worship, and the list goes on and on. We talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Just recently I heard someone in the Chicago area talk about PTSD, but it was present traumatic stress disorder because of all the guns that are in the streets in the hands of people that should not have them. Madam Speaker, today I challenge my colleagues to do the right thing, pass this bill and save lives. Pass this bill and prevent dangerous people from getting guns. Pass this law because you never know if it'll be your son or mother who could be next, gunned down while doing something as routine as praying. Today we need to do the right thing. Today we need to pass H.R. 1112. Today we need to honor the Emanuel 9 and close the Charleston loophole. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
And thank you, Madam Chair. Can I also have the time as well?
The gentleman from Georgia has 15 3/4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, as my chairman just stated, and Madam Speaker, I have no problem with understanding. I can go back through my opening statement and list the many reasons I oppose this bill that have nothing to do with the amendment that should have been fixed by the time we got to rules, which was agreed upon, and actually the language was given by Ms. Lofgren and staff, and we said we'll take that and move to rules to fix it. I'm not opposing, I mean, if you go back and look at my statements already, I'm opposing this bill for many other reasons that are very valid that I believe when you look for timing, you look for other things. So again, I believe working the process is proper. Working the process will go through. And look, the majority should have this, you brought it to the floor, you should have the votes to pass it. But if not, then the Senate can work on this language and we go forward. But I think the bigger issue is the very fundamental issues of the timing of this bill, the timing that it is not just 20 days, it's not just 10 days. There is when you couple it with the actual 30 days restriction on the application itself. So there are plenty of reasons for me to oppose this bill. The other part was simply a discussion that should have been fixed and wasn't, and that's a tragedy for that we're coming to the floor and that even be a problem. But at the end of the day, we pointed it out, we tried to, and that's where it's at. My problem with this bill is the bill itself and many of the languages that we have here. And with that, I do ask the chairman, could I inquire, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, could I inquire if you have any more speakers?
Yes, we do.
Okay, then I'll reserve. Thank you.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, a member of the committee, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I thank Mr. Clyburn, who for years have been working on this issue. H.R. 1112, Enhanced Background Checks of 2019, is long in coming. Responds to many people, but it responds to Dylann Roof. In 2015, went into a gun store to get a gun. He was not the normal purchaser, and it did not approve in 90 seconds, as most of them are. But in a day or two, when it had not yet approved as well, Dylann Roof was able to get a gun, and Dylann Roof's whole message was, I'm going to start a race war by going into an unlocked church on a prayer night and kill 9 worshipers praying to their God and their pastor, whose wife was here today. And so the question has to be, when are we going to stop the senseless killing and the eons and eons of mass shootings? My good friend from Georgia, Mr. Collins, is a man of faith. I was in the committee room as a senior member on the crime subcommittee as we were trying to deliberate his concern, a very vital concern, one that I have, to love people with disabilities, to love them and treat them with dignity. The language in this legislation does that as best we could at the time, because it puts the language adjudicated, determined by some objective body that you have a health problem that deals with a mental concern. And so the question has to be, if it is not workable, you pass the bill, and all of us have made a commitment to work through this process and to give dignity to every person, including a veteran. But at the same time, would you want to have a situation that happened with Dylan Roof, a convicted felon who grabbed the gun in 2 days and killed 9 innocent people, or killed people in various other places?
Madam Speaker, I yield an additional 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman.
The gentlelady is recognized.
From Columbine to Aurora to Virginia Tech, look at the stories, mass shootings, or look at the violence in cities where people are getting guns. So I would make the argument that today we must pass H.R. 1112, and the mercy of all of us dealing with issues to give dignity to those who suffer from illnesses that embrace mental illness concerns. It was because Mr. Collins, a man of faith, offered this suggestion, and therefore we're going to move forward with the commitment to work it through and provide the dignity necessary, but to save the lives and to be tribute in death to those who lost their life at the hands of Dylan Roof. Vote for H.R. 1112. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will inquire of my chairman at this point. Do we have any more speakers?
I have no further speaker. We have no further speakers. I'm prepared to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no others as well, and I'm prepared to close as well, so I'll go ahead and close. Madam Chair, we've had an interesting debate this morning. I think we've went back on 2 points. One, I believe I laid out the problems in a very methodical way on why this bill has serious defects in it that could possibly be fixed if given long enough to work. I still may disagree with the premise of the bill, but could have been worked out when you actually take one part of law and combine it with another part of law, and we've seen a calendaring problem here. So that's one part. That's the main part I have. I think we've also seen how the process has not worked out. Again, sometimes in life, getting it first is not best. Getting it quickly may not always be the best result. And I think what we're seeing here is something that when we're dealing in the rights of individuals, especially in this area here, and especially for the reasons that were given, which was a tragedy in Charleston, which could have been stopped by the FBI, who already had suspicions on not selling this firearm and who could have went and taken that firearm, this is just a problem. But with that, I've laid out as much as I can. I thought our speakers have as well. There are many opposed to this. They'll continue to be opposed to it on both sides of the spectrum. Our sides from the perspective of our rights and those that are being violated, the ACLU for what their reasons may be and others. But it's time we have some honest discussion about what can actually deter this mass violence that we are seeing. And this violence is, unfortunately, Madam Chair, we always speak in mass violence. Why do we always have to go to the big violence? Why don't we have to go to the ones who were killed, which are tragedies we all see? But what about the ones that we can actually work on, where we give better enforcement to our law enforcement, better prosecutions of gun crimes, better prosecution of the straw man person that affect the single life in the neighborhood today? Is the single life not as important as the ones that we're not affecting now? I think as we look forward, I would ask that this, of course, will be voted down, but I think we've laid out a reason why at least should be considered by all members before they put their card in that machine to decide why they are supporting a bill that we believe has some obvious flaws to it. Not the intent of the individual offering it, but the actual words on paper have flaws in them. And that's why we oppose this bill. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Madam Chair, this is an important bill that addresses a significant and tragically demonstrated threat to public safety. Today is the 25th anniversary of the implementation of the Brady Background Check Act. This life-saving law has served us well, helping to prevent firearms from getting into the hands of those who are legally prohibited from possessing and purchasing them. But we know that some aspects of this law and the system that implements it must be updated and improved. Let's remember what this bill does. All this bill does is give the FBI additional time, give the NICS system additional time to complete a background check in the 8 or 9% of cases where it's not done within 90 seconds. If you haven't gotten the background check back in 3 days, under this bill, you can't get it automatically. You can't get the weapon automatically. They have 10 days to do it. If after 10 days they still haven't do it, then you can petition the Attorney General And if they still don't do it, get your firearm within 10 days. That will save a lot of lives. And we hear about mass shootings, but we also should remember, we're not talking just about mass shootings. 34 people a day are killed in this country by guns. 34 a day. Every other industrialized country in the world, 90 deaths with guns a year, 120, 170. The United States, 39,000. And how are we different? Are we thousands of times more mentally ill than people in Europe or Japan? No. Are we more vicious? No. Are our habits more degraded? No. The difference is that this country is awash in guns. The difference is that in this country, people who are dangerous can get guns. These are modest steps. We should take much more advanced steps. We should ban assault weapons. We should ban large capacity magazine clips, but we're not doing that. We're starting with very moderate steps. This is a very moderate step to improve the background check system. And with all the rhetoric we hear, that's all it does. Give a little extra time to make sure that someone who is dangerous, whose possession of a firearm is illegal, cannot get it. Enacting this bill will save lives. I urge my colleagues to ignore all the nonsense rhetoric about extraneous considerations. Join me in supporting this bill today. Join me in supporting saving lives. Join me in making the United States a little safer to live in. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York yields back. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment, in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary, printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-6 is adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as an original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part B of House Report 116-14. Each such further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1 printed in Part B of House Report 116-14. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk shall designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-14, offered by Mr. Rice of South Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 145, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Dylann Roof is a monster. Dylann Roof should never have been able to buy a gun. Dylann Roof walked into a church in my hometown of Charleston, South Carolina, my birthplace of Charleston, South Carolina, and he slaughtered 9 people in a Bible study. I can't imagine a more horrific crime. And we all naturally look for a response. My friend Mr. Clyburn and the majority have noted that thousands of people have wrongfully acquired guns because of the failure of our background check system under what's become known as the Charleston loophole. And the stated purpose of this underlying legislation, Mr. Clyburn's legislation, is certainly noble: to close the Charleston loophole. The only problem is it does not carry out that purpose. Too often here, we take up noble causes and we create legislation with noble names, and we pass this legislation to feel better, but the legislation fails to solve the problem in the title. After these horrific murders, the families of the victims sued the federal government for allowing this monster to buy a gun. Charleston Federal District Judge Gergel wrote a lengthy opinion in which he laid bare the federal background check process and its failures in this case, the case of Dylann Roof. His opinion is available for anybody to read. And in his 22-page opinion, he lays out various structural flaws in the background check system. Most notably that the FBI maintains 4 criminal databases. And under the background check system, the background checker is allowed to check only 3 of those. Why? I assume because those were the 3 that existed in the 90s when the background check system came into place. There's a 4th one. It is more extensive and it is more detailed. It's called Index, capital N-DEX. In this file was all the information that Dylann Roof's background checker needed to know to deny him the right to buy the gun. This index system contained that information, and it is maintained by the FBI. All they had to do was allow this background checker to look at that, and the FBI has admitted, had they been able to do that, this man, this monster, would never have been able to buy a gun. My amendment would actually fix the Charleston loophole. The problem is that I cannot support the underlying legislation. Why? Because it creates an undue amount of time to be able to buy a gun. And number 2, the thing that bothers me the most is it shifts a part of the burden to the American citizen trying to exercise his Second Amendment rights. It requires him, in the event that you don't hear back from the government, to file a petition with the federal court. I think this is an undue interference with his Second Amendment right. Therefore, I cannot accept this underlying legislation. And the Senate has indicated it will not be taken up in the Senate, and the President has indicated that if it passed, he would veto it. Therefore, I plan to withdraw my amendment. I plan to offer it separately as a new piece of legislation, which will, in fact, close the Charleston loophole. It will allow the FBI background checkers to search the most current index file that has all this detailed information that was created after 9/11, well after the background check law came into effect. It would have prevented, the FBI has admitted it would have prevented Dylann Roof from buying a gun, and I suspect many of the other people who have carried out these horrific shootings in recent years. It will hopefully garner the bipartisan support necessary to actually become law and fix the underlying problem. I withdraw my amendment and I yield back the balance of my time.
Would the gentleman yield for just a moment?
Yes.
The time has expired.
I look forward to supporting the gentleman.
Thank you.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report 116-14. For what purpose does a gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report Number 116-14, offered by Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 145, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of my amendment to H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019, and I applaud my friend from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn, for his leadership and enduring commitment to reduce gun violence and make our communities safer. And I also appreciate my friend from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee, for her leadership on this issue as well. Mr. Speaker, it is unconscionable to think that convicted felons, domestic abusers, and others who are prohibited by law from purchasing a firearm could end up with these weapons anyway. Sadly, this is the reality we currently live in due to the default proceeds sales, also known as the Charleston loophole. I've introduced legislation on this problem in the past because we must do everything we can to ensure firearms do not end up in the hands of those who should not have them. This is why I am also a co-sponsor of Mr. Clyburn's Enhanced Background Checks Act. The FBI should, in fact needs to know if a default proceeds sale has taken place. Currently, this is not the case unless the FBI eventually completes a background check, determines the purchaser should be prohibited from owning a firearm, and subsequently contacts the dealer. We need more information throughout this process, and my amendment would do just that. Require the FBI to report on the number of background checks that they are not able to complete within the designated time period. This information will help keep track of the FBI's ability to clear background checks in a timely manner, as well as give better understanding of where there is still room for improvement. It will also provide much-needed transparency to the default proceed process. All who support common sense solutions to reduce the gun violence epidemic in this country should support this amendment and the underlying legislation. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes. I would now like to yield 2 minutes to my dear friend and a tireless champion and leader on the efforts to reduce gun violence, the gentlewoman from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee.
The gentlelady's recognized.
I thank the gentleman very much, and I thank him for his leadership on a very important enhancement to the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019, which requires the FBI to report on the number of petitions it was not able to make a determination on within the 10-day period. I think Mrs. Snyder knows that why we're here on the floor is to save lives, to be able to protect innocent people from being subjected to what the Emanuel 9 was, worshipers in a church with their pastor praying as this country allows one to do. It is my belief that the Snyder-Jackson Lee Amendment should be passed because with this critical data and compliance reporting, we can learn more about legislative injustices like the one that enabled Dylan Roof to process a handgun used to murder 9 innocent persons at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And to remind everybody, he had not been approved by the NICS reporting system, and he was able to come back. This system allows us to know how many have not been approved to be able to address the question to have better policies dealing with protecting gun violence. So it is my privilege to join my colleague in supporting the Snyder-Jackson Lee Amendment, and I close by saying that this tracks the Accidental Firearms Transfer Reporting Act that I introduced in previous Congresses in H.R. 3125 and H.R. 57. I look forward to working with my colleague as we expand reasonable gun safety legislation to protect our children, our families, and Americans. With that, I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. I would now like to yield 1 minute to the chairman of the committee, Mr. Nadler from New York.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I support this amendment, which requires the FBI to report on the number of petitions it was not able to resolve with a determination within 10 days. We know that providing more time for checks to be completed in the instances that more time is needed will help prevent guns from getting into the hands of those who are ineligible under current law from purchasing and possessing the guns. That is the goal of this bill, is to do just that, and to allow individuals whose checks take longer than 10 days to complete the opportunity to petition for their case to be reviewed within another 10-day period. The report required by this amendment will help us oversee the implementation of this new process and the changes instituted by this law. I urge my colleagues to support this salutary amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
The gentleman from Georgia, do you have any speakers on this issue?
No, to my good gentleman, I do not.
All right. Thank you. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 116-14. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-14, offered by Mr. Levin of Michigan.
Pursuant to House Resolution 145, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, and a member opposed, each will control, 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm proud to co-sponsor the Enhanced Background Checks Act, H.R. 1112. And I'm also proud today to present an amendment that will make sure we can track and learn from the good that this bill will accomplish once it becomes law. In 2017, 39,773 Americans died from gun violence. This is a public health epidemic. Under current law, if a background check is not completed within 3 business days, a federally licensed firearms dealer may move forward with a firearms transfer or sale. The devastating reality is that many horrific acts of gun violence, including the massacre at the Emmanuel African Methodist Church in Charleston, South Carolina, which ended 9 lives and left several people wounded, could have been avoided. Today, we will vote to close the loophole that allowed for that tragedy. By closing what has become known as the Charleston loophole, the Enhanced Background Checks Act will provide the background check system with additional time to make a final determination on a potential firearms purchaser before a licensed dealer can transfer a gun. We have an obligation to the American people and to the victims of the shooter at the AME Church to pass the bill before us today, and I'm proud to be part of this effort to protect our communities from gun violence. My amendment to H.R. 1112 will require the Government Accountability Office to submit a report to Congress 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years following the implementation of this law. These reports will analyze the extent to which the changes made by this law will prevent firearms from being transferred to prohibited persons. I'm proud that this amendment has broad support from all stakeholders that have been involved in making this bill a reality. We must strive for effective, evidence-based policies that promote public health and protect our communities. My amendment will cost us nothing, but it will help build the evidence base around the effectiveness of good gun violence prevention policies like this one. This amendment is all the more important given the regrettable lack of federal funding for gun violence research. My amendment will finally help us demonstrate with data that gun violence prevention measures like the one before us today will prevent firearms from ending up in the hands of people who should not have them. I came to Washington because the people of southern Macomb and southeastern Oakland counties sent me here on a mission, and that mission includes protecting our communities from senseless gun violence. I stand today in solidarity with the courageous people of Michigan's 9th Congressional District's Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action. We have a responsibility as members of Congress and as human beings, not just to talk about the horrors of gun violence, but to do everything in our powers to end it. Today, we will take a critically necessary step to do just that. I'd like to thank Congressman Jim Clyburn, Peter King, and Joe Cunningham for their leadership to ensure that we close the Charleston loophole. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1112 and to support this amendment. I yield 1 minute to the chairman.
The gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I support this amendment to require the GAO to submit a report to the relevant congressional committees analyzing the extent to which the additions required by this bill prevent firearms from being transferred to prohibited persons. It will be important for us to get information about the implementation of the law and its impact on so-called default proceed transactions. The amendment also requires that the GAO report its findings after 90 days and then again after 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years. I think it's always a good idea to actually track the effect of new legislation and see how effective it is. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment, and I commend the sponsor for doing so. I yield back the balance of my...
Thank you so much, Mr. Nadler. I reserve, Madam Chairman.
The gentleman from Michigan reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Does the gentleman from Georgia have speakers who will speak in opposition?
No.
Then I yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia?
I yield back as well.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 4, printed in Part B of House Report 116-14. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-14, offered by Ms. Porter of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 145, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
I yield myself 3 minutes.
Without
when we
objection.
discuss the epidemic of gun violence in our country, we must confront the issues of domestic violence, domestic abuse, dating partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking. According to the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, firearms pose a significant danger to victims of domestic violence, and this is true no matter who owns the firearm. Research shows that a male abuser's access to a firearm increases the risk of intimate partner femicide 5-fold and does not support the contention that firearm possession is a protective factor of the victim. The fact is, prohibited buyers who obtain a firearm through the Charleston loophole are disproportionately likely to be prohibited because of domestic violence. Indeed, in 2017, 23% of cases where a gun was transferred to a prohibited purchaser through a default proceeds sale involved a person prohibited due to a conviction for domestic violence or prohibited due to a domestic violence restraining order. Denials related to domestic violence require more investigation often than denials based on other factors. I am offering this amendment so that this bill's background check process, before it goes into effect, Congress can hear from experts in the Justice Department and at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence and Firearms on whether any changes could be made to better protect victims of domestic violence. This amendment requires the study on domestic violence to be completed within 150 days. If the Van Drew amendment passes, this bill will have an effective date of 210 days after enactment. If the study finds that further changes would be advisable to better protect domestic violence victims, Congress will have enough time to make those changes. I yield 2 minutes to my colleague from Wisconsin.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Let me thank the gentlelady for offering this amendment along with our other colleagues to H.R. 1112 that would simply require the Department of Justice to release a report analyzing the effect of this bill's provisions on the safety of the victims of domestic violence, domestic abuse, dating partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking. I'm here on the floor today, Madam Chairwoman, with the hopes that my colleagues will listen to the 10 million men, women, and children who experience domestic violence each year. Domestic violence is a horrible scourge, and the presence or possession of a gun only worsens these tragedies. You heard my colleague, Representative Porter, say that women are 5 times more likely to die, be killed in a domestic violence situation if a gun is owned. Which is one of the reasons, Madam Chair, I've introduced legislation to help incentivize states to adopt laws that ensure that we do everything to take guns from those with a court restraining order or other protective order. I hope, Madam Chair, that my colleagues will listen to the 1 to 3 women and 1 in 4 men who have been victims of intimate partner violence. I sure hope that colleagues will listen to me as one of the 4.5 million women who've experienced gun violence firsthand. There's much discussion in these chambers about a national emergency. Gun violence, domestic violence is a national emergency. And that's why we've offered this amendment, so that our laws actually reflect the realities. The data collected will be critical to inform Congress about ways to prevent needless tragedies in our country, and to help us evolve in a way that more will protect our constituents. Thank you so much for your indulgence, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. For what purpose does a gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Claims time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Okay. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part B of House Report 116-14. For what purpose does a gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-14, offered by Mr. Van Drew of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 145, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume, Madam Chairman. My amendment would ensure that from the date of a firearm purchase is legally authorized under the bill, the firearm purchaser has 25 calendar days to pick up their gun, regardless of how much time has elapsed since the background check was first initiated. This would prevent a situation under the bill as it is written that, although rare, would still be possible, where the maximum allowable number of business days, 20 business days, that a purchaser would have to wait for an approval could actually run longer, hypothetically, than the 30 days. That would be problematic, because under a current ATF Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives regulation, a gun cannot be transferred after 30 days once a background check begins. Where more than 30 calendar days have passed since the licensee first contacted NICS, the National Institute Criminal Background Check System, the licensee must initiate a new NICS check prior to transferring the firearm. My amendment would prevent an unnecessary background check do-over. For those who get approved by the FBI after 3 business days, my amendment would essentially nullify the 30 days ATF regulation, allowing prospective firearm owners the peace of mind that they do deserve. After this bill went through the Judiciary Committee, the point was raised that an existing ATF regulation, if left unchanged, could result in a situation where even after a background check was approved or a petition process was followed, the lawful gun buyer would still not be able to get the gun without doing a second background check because too much time had elapsed since the first background check began. This is clearly not the intent of the bill. And while I believe that ATF would amend the regulation if this bill is passed, this amendment removes all doubt. Anyone who is legally authorized to obtain a firearm under the new process will have ample time, 25 days, to return to the dealer and retrieve the gun. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, I appreciate the gentleman here on this. It's good to fix this. I mean, but the only problem is it doesn't fix it. And I think that's the problem that we're looking at is written, and we discussed earlier, your amendment claims to prevent this in loop, but it fails to do so. Per ATF regulation, the NICS check is only valid for 30 calendar days from when the NICS is initially contacted. This language does not extend the time frame in the event of a delay response, nor does it direct the Attorney General to do so. So if the purchaser completes the three-step process under H.R. 1112, then attempts to take ATF regulations would suggest it is too late. The NICS check has expired, and as a result, the federally licensed firearms dealer would need to conduct a new NICS check while restarting the process. Madam Chair, I did offer an amendment to extend the validity of the NICS check to 60 days to cure this deficiency. However, the Democrats refused to make my amendment in order, and so for that reason, I'm glad that the gentleman is trying to fix this, which is where it should be. It just doesn't fix it. And so we're again searching for an amendment and solution to a problem that could have been fixed, but this one does not. I'm glad the gentleman brought the amendment, and in the plain reading of the statute and the plain reading of this amendment, this is a great attempt. It just falls short. And for that reason, I would urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment when it would not actually fix the problem we outlined earlier. And with that, I'll reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Chairwoman, I would just again emphasize that this is 25 days after the approval, that also law supersedes regulation, and there is no question that that 25 days would be in place, and that would give more than a sufficient amount of time, in fact, a lenient amount of time, just to ensure that there aren't any problems here. I reserve the balance of my time, and I would yield to the chairman, Chairman Nadler, to speak in favor of this amendment.
How much time?
I thank the gentleman.
How much time does the gentleman seek? Okay, 1 minute.
I thank
the gentleman's
gentleman for
recognized.
yielding. I rise in support of this amendment, and this completely takes care of Mr. Collins' concern, whether he realizes it or not, because this says that the transfer can take place for 25 days after the transfer becomes legally permissible. In other words, under the longest time frame, the background check doesn't come back within 10 days. The purchaser waits a few days and then petitions the Attorney General. Takes another 10 days. Then it becomes legally permissible. This says the transfer can take place for 25 days after that. So there's no way that this doesn't take care of the problem that Mr. Collins raised and then some. The current procedures in place do not take into account the longer waiting period and petition process. More than takes care of that. It's a salutary amendment. It makes the system work. And I can't understand anybody, whether they support the bill or not, who wouldn't want to support this. I yield back. So I support the amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves.
And I thank the chairman. And just as a couple of other points, just on a personal level, I have been always a supporter of Second Amendment rights, continue to be. And the purpose of that is to obviously do so, support Second Amendment rights. Secondly, I know that there's language in another part of the bill that many people have asked me about, which is not something that I'm amending or had to do with, but I know that there is a commitment from leadership that that language is going to be completely redone, and that language will be totally appropriate and actually will be a major improvement. And I yield.
The gentleman yields back and reserves, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I appreciate my chairman in this, but I disagree because there is still the 30-day limitation. And the 30-day limitation is not done here, and so there is and could be a problem if it was done, and I still have my time and there's no time left. The issue here is that if it is approved after the 30 days, then this bill does not fix it. The easy fix here was an amendment we offered that simply extended it for 60 days. That's your fix. Instead, we go through this, which there can be, as all good things lawyerly, we can have lawyerly disagreements. I think in the end, when actually gone back and looked at this, you will see that there is an interpretation problem here. The 30 days still exists. Why could we have not just simply extended the next step for 60 days instead of 30 days, instead of going through this exercise of legal interpretation? With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back. The gentleman from...
Madam Chairman, I meant to reserve. May I have?
Okay.
I just would like to clearly say here that
the gentleman
I think
will suspend. Does the gentleman ask unanimous consent to reclaim his time?
Yes.
The gentleman...
Objection is heard.
The objection is heard.
Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman.
Okay.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings now will resume on those amendments printed in Part B of House Report 116-14, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Schneider of Illinois. Amendment number 5 by Mr. Van Drew of New Jersey. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 2, printed in Part B of House Reports 116-14 by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by a voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-14, offered by Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
And today, the second half of the House two-day gun debate. Yesterday, they passed a bill that would expand background checks, requiring federally licensed background checks for private sales, and today taking up a measure that would expand the amount of time the FBI has to complete those background checks from 3 days to up to 20 days to complete the work. And they are voting now on a couple of amendments. This one by Congressman Schneider of Illinois would require the FBI to report the number of petitions it wasn't able to make determination with within the required 10-day period. So an amendment vote here, 15 minutes, another amendment vote as well. And we might see a motion to recommit on this legislation as well. Republicans successful yesterday in adding an amendment to the final measure that would call for the notification of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement if an undocumented immigrant were to try to purchase a firearm. So a 15-minute vote here on the House floor. We're going to take you live to the comments from Speaker Pelosi